All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, good morning, good Shabbos, everybody. This morning, I'd like to raise a topic that I guess affects many people, and that is the whole issue that's brought up by various museums. Basically, because many museums have in there mummies, or they have skeletons, or preserved bodies, plus the whole prohibition of creating three-dimensional images. How does that affect us when it comes to visiting museums? And there are basically three different issues. The first issue is whether Kohanim are allowed to visit museums that have mummies or other human remains. That's issue number one for Kohanim. Issue number two, what about wax museums, which have three-dimensional depictions of people? And does it make a difference if they were made by Jews or not made by Jews? But the whole prohibition of having three-dimensional human figures or looking at them, is there any prohibition there? And then the third issue relates to whether or not you can have Tashmishe Kedusha, specifically Sifrei Torah, in a museum. Is that the appropriate place to put a Sefer Torah and other Tashmishe Kedusha? So specifically, let's start with the Kohanim. We know that Kohanim cannot be in touch with a dead body. The Kohanim don't go to cemeteries. Does it make a difference if the bodies are Jewish or non-Jewish? Can a Kohen go to a non-Jewish cemetery? There's also something called Tumas Ohel, which we'll get to in a moment. But the Gemara seems to feel, it's Gemara in Bava Metzia, Rashim Bayachai says, Kivreim shel ovdei kachavim ein metamim. The remains of non-Jews, specifically ovdei kachavim, idol worshippers, do not cause ritual impurity. So from that basis alone, we can say that it might be permissible. However, the Gemara in Yevamos modifies this position, and it says it refers to Tumas Ohel, that implying that non-Jewish bodies can give off Tuma in terms of contact, but not necessarily in terms of Ohel. So what is the whole issue of Ohel? The issue of Ohel is that if a dead body is in an enclosed space, then the Tuma envelops that entire space, which is why I remember at yeshiva, very often, if one of the Rosh Yeshiva or one of the great Rabbanim would pass away, they would have the funeral in the auditorium, which would hold thousands of people, and they would have boys going around through all the classrooms all morning long saying, if you are a Kohen, please leave the building by 11 o'clock, because they were bringing in the Aron. The same way that you have many funeral homes have an area outside in the parking lot with a microphone and a TV camera, so Kohanim can observe the funeral but not go inside, because that's called Tumas Ohel, an enclosed space. And the machlokas in the Gemara is whether that applies to non-Jews or not. If you settle in a town that was a non-Jewish town that was destroyed, you don't have to worry about non-Jewish graves, according to the Mishnah, which means that non-Jewish cadavers ordinarily don't impart tuma unless it's tumas ohel type of situation. So, how do the Rishonim and how does the halacha apply this to museums and similar situations? The Rosh says that we follow Shimon ben Gamliel, and that basically we don't feel that non-Jewish bodies can impart tuma. So based on that, a Kohen might be able to go to a museum that has mummies. However, the Maharam Rutenberg reportedly has told Kohanim, don't come in contact with non-Jewish graves. So there's a lot of lack of clarity or precision here. Basically, the Rambam and others poskin that non-Jews can impart tuma through contact, but not necessarily through tumas ohel. But nevertheless, since there's a machlokes, it's better to be machmir. But the ikar adin is that they don't impart tuma. So practically speaking, although it might be preferable kohanim not to walk on the graves of non-Jews, nevertheless we should be machmir. In terms of going to a museum where there are mummies involved, again, there are heterim for that, especially if the mummies are not Jewish mummies. The Jewish mummies, it's a whole other problem. We don't have too many Jewish mummies, even though we read last week that Yaakov and Yosef were mummified, because that was the Egyptian practice. Nevertheless, we don't believe in this practice. But in most museums, the skeletons or the mummies would not be Jewish. So there are many heterim there. You have a situation, for example, if you have a Nazir, and Nazir became Tameh, and then he became Tameh a second time, he doesn't get Makos the second time around. Now, what's the connection? Because Kohanim today we're all considered Tameh Mason. There's nobody today that's 100% Tahor. So therefore, there are a number of leniencies that you could use. It's a fascinating tshuva brought down if it's permissible for Kohanim to engage in the business of selling mummies. Apparently that was a business at one point in the Middle Ages. And they've been preserved for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. And that doesn't make a difference. The mummy still has a certain status. They're human enough to still impart tuma through contact. So again, even though there may be heterim, we are generally warned to be machmir. Okay. There's an interesting situation that was brought up to the Avnei Nezer, Sakach of a Rebbe. He has a Kohen who lived next door to a non-Jew had died, and they kept the body in the house that he was attached to. And basically, he wasn't able to leave his house because he'd have to pass through this corridor where the dead body was kept. And again, me'ikar hadin, there was no tumas ohel, and he allowed him to go out so he can go davening, enjoy Shabbos, go for a walk and so forth. But apparently, these questions came up. More practically speaking, very often, if you go to certain doctors' offices, I don't know how many still do it anymore, many of them might have a skeleton in their office. Now, in many cases, probably a plastic skeleton. But in some cases, to show the body, and I'm not talking about the Halloween type of skeleton, but in doctors' offices or in the attic, or they may have bones, this could be a real halakhic shaila. But again, shasat chak, there are all types of heterim you can utilize. This applies, of course, to hospitals. Can a Kohen go into a hospital? And there are dead bodies in a hospital all the time. In their morgue and wait for burial. People die in hospitals. It happens. So it could be very, very problematic for Kohanim to go into a hospital, especially since some of those bodies who have passed away could be Jewish. So that could be a serious issue that I don't know if people are conscious of or they talk about it too often. Let's go to a second related topic, which is not necessarily mummified remains or people who have passed away, Jewish or non-Jewish, but the whole notion of having statues or three-dimensional representations or wax museum type of situation. The halacha is very clear. Give me the exact quotes. The Gemara says, Mem Gimel Lamed Beis, Kol ha-partsufim mutarim chutz mi partsuf adam. Every three-dimensional model, statue, if you will, is permissible except for humans. So you could have models of animals, you could have all kinds of, but you shouldn't have a statue in your home. I mean, one of the 10 Commandments is not to have three-dimensional statues. And you'll notice that not only statues, but very often paintings. In some very religious homes, they don't have artwork showing the human form. In some cases, they might, because there are heterim, but there are many, many people who avoid having, photographs, yes, but pictures, painted pictures, statues for sure you don't find because of this prohibition. And the Shulchan Aruch codifies la halacha that you cannot create a three-dimensional human body, even if it's just to admire it as a work of art. So this, of course, raises the question about, can a Jewish artist be a sculptor? Well, not of the human form, apparently, according to the halacha. On the other hand, and there's always the other hand, we're talking about Ovdei Avodah Zarah. That's the context in which this prohibition is discussed in the Gemara. And today's people are not, non-Jews don't necessarily worship idols anymore. I mean, you may find some group somewhere in the world that does, but even Catholicism, with all of its statues and all of its saints, all that they have in their churches, they don't worship the statues per se. They worship what the statue represents. So you don't have technically Ovdei Avodah Zarah in the same way. But the prohibition still exists. And one of the questions that comes up, and I am not here to paskin on that, what about the whole issue of children playing with dolls? Dolls are all made in human form. Is there a prohibition for Jewish children to play with dolls? I'm not paskening. I don't want to destroy anybody's childhood, but clearly there are heterim, obviously, to own dolls, but not necessarily to make them or sell them. But you have clear prohibitions about three-dimensional art. We don't really think about this because in the modern world, this is not something that people focus on. But clearly there are many, many views in the Gemara, expressed in the Gemara and the Poskim, that three-dimensional images are a no-no. Not only to have them, to look at them, to admire them. Rav Moshe Sternbuch in his Tshuvos tries to make a distinction between models, or specifically in a wax museum, if it's made, crafted by a non-Jew versus those made by a Jew. If it's made by a non-Jew, then it might be technically permissible to admire them. If they were made by a Jew, since there is a prohibition of even making three-dimensional objects of human beings, that could be very, very problematic. And therefore, visiting museums, if the three-dimensional objects were made by Jews, is viewed as endorsing this particular Aveira. A practical consideration. You have museums in Israel. You have Jewish museums in Israel, or museums that are run by Jews and have Jewish artists who contribute their artwork to it. And in many cases, you have three-dimensional figures in some of these museums in Israel. Is there a prohibition of any sort from going into these museums, admiring them, and so forth, if the three-dimensional objects were made by Jews, whether it's a wax museum or a regular museum? So these are considerations. I'm just raising the question because it's a fascinating question. And if you have any specific questions about whether you can go to a museum or doctor's offices that have skeletons, I would consult your local rabbi. Again, there are many heterim. I'm not pasking, I'm just raising the issue. The last issue concerning museums is whether or not a museum is a proper repository for a Sefer Torah. A Sefer Torah is meant to be laid. A Sefer Torah that is no longer usable gets buried. There's a certain kavod, a dignity to a Sefer Torah. Is it appropriate to donate a Sefer Torah to a museum. So we have to try to find some earlier sources. The Ramah says it discusses the question of whether you can give a mezuzah to a non-Jew. And again, he says you shouldn't, but if there is concern, and you can't use it because the non-Jew may not treat it carefully, may not treat it properly. However, if there's a concern that as a result of not giving it, it'll generate Jewish hatred more than already exists, then one may do so. So that might apply also to giving a Sefer Torah to a non-Jewish museum. Contemporary poskim, of course, deal with this issue all the time because we had.
Well, what if you give a Sefer Torah? I think there's one I've heard the story say. I think the Sefer Torah that was given to Harry Truman by Chaim Weizmann is now on the USS Truman on a ship, so that they can use it.
It's being used? That's correct.
Is that okay because it's being used?
Yeah, of course. If it's being, the Sefer Torah is meant to be used. Now, if you have Sefer Torah that are puzzle.
But what about those Sefer Torahs that they have from the Holocaust?
And
they display them as sort of museums.
That's what I'm coming to right now. You have many Sefer Torah that were saved from the Holocaust, which are puzzle that for one reason or another they're missing a piece or they're invalid to be used for laning, and if it's not done in a way that is disrespectful, if derech bizoyo they call it, and if it's owned by a non-Jew, it's one thing. But if Jews donate it and it's for educational purposes, and again, it's a puzzle Sefer Torah. There are a number of poskim who say that it will be permissible, especially to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. You have many museums that do have Sefer Torah, and many shuls that have Sefer Torah in a museum case for display. It's done as long as it's done in a respectful manner. If you visit the Spanish Portuguese shul in Manhattan, which is a wonderful place to visit anyway, it's a great place for a tour, Mendy. If you want to set up a tour to the Spanish Portuguese Museum, the synagogue on Central Park. Central Park was a Central Park West on 70th Street. One of their display cases has a Sefer Torah from I think it was the War of 1812 when the British invaded Manhattan, and they trashed the original Spanish Portuguese shul was located downtown, and the Sefer Torah on display has a horse's hoof print on it from one of the British soldiers. Again, the Sefer Torah is puzzle, but the history there is very rich and is done in a very respectful way. And same way with many Holocaust Sefer Torah that are there are many shuls in Bergen County every year, when we have the Yom HaShoah program for the community, they bring these Sefer Torah from the Holocaust in a procession, and in the shuls during the year they're kept in special honorable cases or respectful positions. As long as you're giving Torah an honor, a kibud, then and it can't be used as puzzle. It's certainly permissible. The only time it would not be permissible to give a Sefer Torah to a museum is if it's a brand new Sefer Torah. If somebody commissions a Sefer Torah to be written in order to donate it to the museum in somebody's memory, even though it may not be derech bizoyon, it's not an ideal situation. Put it that way. There are a number of poskim who are opposed to it, but then again, most poskim would say that if Tashmishe Kedusha or a Sefer Torah is done in a respectful way, it could be done. Rav Kook says, I don't see a problem with it. He died in 1935. However, he doesn't want to be, counted among those who permit putting a real Sefer Torah in a museum. Apostle Sefer Torah is one thing, but a kosher Sefer Torah would be very problematic. Again, if it's done, you have Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, post-Holocaust post. He died in 1966. And he writes that ideally, if you can avoid it, it would be best. But if it's done in a covetic way, for example, we take out a Sefer Torah to honor the Melech. That's his logic. And today, the government is in place of the Melech, and the purpose is to give respect and honor to the Torah. It's covered Torah, it would be permissible. The final word on this, Rav Moshe Feinstein Paskin, that if a Sefer Torah is possible, it's worn out, then putting it on display might be better than burying it, because at least it would continue to be used or respected or viewed. And also the fact that it may have been a Holocaust Sefer Torah, he doesn't think that makes a difference, whether it is or isn't. But if Sefer Torah is possible and it can't be used anymore, but putting it on display would add cover and dignity to the Sefer Torah, what it represents, then it might be better than burying it. I mean, we bury it out of respect. Putting it into museum would also be done in a respectful way, and it might be permissible. So you have a number of issues concerning contemporary museums. You have putting a Sefer Torah in a museum, you have three-dimensional figures in a museum, and you have actual human remains in a museum, and the different halachas apply in each of these cases. Putting a Sefer Torah, we can come to a conclusion that in all probability it is permissible if it's done in a respectful, covetic way. Crafting three-dimensional images could be very problematic, especially if it's Jews that are doing the crafting. Having them in your possession could also be problematic. And of course, the issue of dolls comes up. And then certainly the issue as applies to human remains for Kohanim, visiting museums where there are cadavers or mummies. So it isn't just the depiction of the human form, it's the actual human form or its body itself in one form. There was a display making the rounds, I don't know if it's still going around, called The Human Body, where they have actual cadavers, preserved cadavers, to show you what it looks like under the skin. And it was a traveling exhibit all over the country, maybe all over the world for all I know. And halachically, this could cause a number of problems. I mean, I don't know if the bodies that they had were Jewish or non-Jewish, but there are so many issues concerning the human form. As I said, if you walk into most rabbis, I would say all rabbis' homes do not have statues of people. That's not a Jewish thing to do. Portraits, photos, perhaps, but actual three-dimensional images are not something. Many people would have a bust of Plato on their desk or a bust of the Rambam. It's really inappropriate, especially certainly again if it's made by a Jew. So these are some issues to consider.
Rabbi?
About museums. Yes, question.
It's not with museums, but it is with bodies. So almost from a halachic point of view, a Kohen shouldn't go to medical school if he has to work with cadavers.
Correct. Rav Hershel Schachter Paskin, unequivocally, Kohanim should not be doctors.
Wow.
He said that you cannot go. He prohibited his students, their Kohanim, to go to medical school, because you're constantly surrounded by cadavers. Now, interestingly enough, in medical schools today, it's not as much as it used to be, because today they study anatomy on the computer, and they're really they do much more detail on a computer than you can actually do in an anatomy lab. It's hard to believe, but even so, you're in hospitals all the time. I remember Rabbi Tendler Zatzal, even for non-Kohanim, I remember in one of our classes, he said that if you go to medical school, make sure your lab partner is a non-Jew. So he makes the first incision in the cadaver. So because they have the inyan of nivel hamesh, you're not allowed to desecrate the human form in any way. So if you're doing anatomy and you're cutting up a human body, let the non-Jew make the first incision. So at least you're not guilty of that. But Rav Schachter was very, very opposed, very clearly said that Kohanim cannot go to medical school, period.
Does this apply to a bat Kohen?
A bat Kohen? Interesting. Interesting question. Interesting question. A bat Kohen. Well, it's interesting. Is a bat Kohen prohibited from going into a cemetery? Interesting question. I don't know the answer. I'll have to find out. That's a very interesting question. Does a bat Kohen have all the halachas of an actual Kohen? I would probably think not.
Right.
Because a bat Kohen doesn't serve in the Beis HaMikdash. A bat Kohen doesn't duchen. She eats truma, but I don't think she serves in a Kohen capacity. So based on that, I would think it would not apply to a bat Kohen.
Wally,
Yes.
how about a bat Kohen that's pregnant and she's definitely going to have a son?
Whoa.
Can she go to the cemetery then?
That happens to be a shiloh that is asked, and we try to avoid that for that reason. If a bat Kohen is pregnant, they do not go to the cemetery because it might be a son. Absolutely. Now that is discussed in the halacha, and very clearly that a bat Kohen who is pregnant does not go to a cemetery or even to a funeral for that matter, because that's too much ohel. And even now this is all even despite the fact that everybody today is considered tamei meis. There's nobody today that is completely tahor anymore. I mean, they are preparing in Israel. There are a few, very, very few farms that are trying to preserve Torah Aduma in order to purify Kohanim. When Mashiach comes, the base of is rebuilt, they'll have the Torah Aduma available, and they can make the ashes to purify Kohanim to the first service in the Avodah of the Beis HaMikdash. But until that happens, everybody today is considered tamei meis. So, these are questions.
Wally,
Yes.
do the ashes of a Jew who was cremated, do they give off tumor?
I would think so. Yeah, I would, and that's also problematic because sometimes people, it's bad enough to cremate somebody, then to keep the ashes in an urn in your home, compounds the problem. It's a serious issue with cremation today, which is certainly not a halachic practice. But keeping those remains on a mantelpiece in your home, clearly very, very problematic to do that.
Better to keep them in a drawer?
I'm sorry?
Better to keep them in a drawer somewhere?
Better not to cremate them at all. A more fascinating question is some people cremate their pets to keep them with them all the time. Is there any tumor associated with that? In all probability, I would think not. But if you're a Kohen, you definitely shouldn't have ashes of any human or animal around, because that certainly creates tumor for a Kohen. But if you're a non-Kohen, having cremated ashes of a pet around, it's weird. But it would be less of a problem. Any other questions? Okay, so art museums are okay to go to, but museums with mummies and human remains, if you're a Kohen, is very, very problematic. And of course, three-dimensional objects, and you can't avoid it. Every museum you go to has models of Indians or Eskimos or natives or prehistoric man. They all have these three-dimensional depictions. And in most cases, it would be less problematic. But in Israel, where the people who made these things might be Jewish, there are serious halakhic concerns because you can't create three-dimensional objects, and you certainly can't derive pleasure from viewing them. But
what about a statue in Central Park?
It's there. I mean, whether you should specifically go to view the statue is a different question. You can avoid walking by. That would probably be better. I mean, it's very hard in today's society when you have statues all over the place to avoid it. but you're certainly not doing it on purpose. If it happened to you walking by and the statue is there, you can't help that. But to go and admire the statue, that might not necessarily be a Jewish practice, admiring statues. So related to that, can you go to admire the Statue of Liberty? It's also a big statue. I am not poskening that Shiloh at all. Many people, when they came to this country, that's what they were looking for as they entered the port of New York. And they, they were so glad to see a Statue of Liberty. It's a three-dimensional depiction of a woman. These are interesting shilohs that the Jews living in the ancient and medieval world didn't necessarily have to deal with. The ancient world, perhaps, it was the Roman and Greek statues all the time. But in Europe, aside from the church, you didn't have too many statues. So there was less of a problem. But today, statues are all over the place. So in terms of avoiding them, admiring them, these are issues that the halacha is very concerned about. Avram Avinu introduced a radical concept into the world, which is understanding the concept or the notion, the very idea of a non-physical God that controls the universe. It's like gravity. You don't see it, but it's there. It's a force. The difference between gravity and God is that it's a conscious force at work in the universe. And being invisible, that was a major innovation in the world. Judaism is the only religion that has this invisible God, who's all-powerful, all-knowing, but is there. And that's why all this serious opposition to physical depictions and avodah zarah and idol worship, because idol worship goes back into the most ancient, because that's how ancient man grappled with the universe. They knew there were forces at work in the universe. They didn't understand them, so they made depictions. This is the statue. This is the god of thunder. This is the god of lightning. This is the god of fertility. This is the god of agriculture. That's their limited understanding, whereas Avram introduced a whole new concept, which we're still carrying forward, which is why, unfortunately, Jews have been persecuted throughout history, because our beliefs are so radically different from everybody else. Needs a physical depiction of their deity. We don't. And that, among other things, makes us very, very different from everybody else. So that's our Musar for the week. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Stay warm and watch out for the snow that's coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Marlo.
Shabbos.
Thanks a lot.
Great Shabbos.